Okay, so thank you. All right, so going back to what I was saying, we've talked a lot about the hashkafa and those ideas, but Emir Hashem, this week, what we're going to touch upon is all the halacha, the practical laws that come up with reciting the 13 attributes of mercy, both together, both on our own, and just other things. Even before we start with the Gemara, just to realize how practical some of the stuff that we touched upon last week was. So we talked about Hashem, Hashem. Those were the first two names of the attributes of mercy. And Chazar is always good. So to go back and review a little bit. So the first week we talked about Hashem, Hashem, that we're trying to recall those moments in time where God thought to create the world with judgment. And he realized it wouldn't be sustainable. And so he added a little bit of mercy. And that was Hashem, Hashem, the Yud Ke Vav Ke, the name of mercy, kindness. And he infused that to temper his judgment. So that's what we're trying to invoke, those moments in, thank you, those moments in time. And then we said that Hashem, Hashem was a further aspect of us trying to reach out to those attributes of God that we ourselves can mimic, of how we can interact with other people. So we said that there really were two different ways to count the 13 attributes. One of those was to say that the first name of Hashem, Yud Ke Vav Ke, wasn't actually part of the 13. And the reason being is because it really was a preface. It was to say, Hashem, Yud Ke Vav Ke, this is your name in which you now manifest in all these following attributes. So that would actually come out in a different way. We would exclaim. So we started Selichos last night. And so classically, what do we say? We say, V'yavor Hashem al pana vayikra. And then we go on to say, Hashem, Hashem kel rachum v'chanim. So if it were to be that the first two names of Hashem were not part of the 13 attributes, and only one of them was, so we would actually be saying things quite differently. We would probably be saying, Vayikra b'shem Hashem, and he called out in the name of God, in the name of mercy, the following names, Hashem, Kel, Rachum, and we wouldn't say that first attribute of Yud Ke Vav Ke. So to just realize that how and what is the proper number of the 13 and what exactly we're trying to reach out to would make a difference in what we say. That's just one example, but again, we're going to focus a little bit more on practical things that we do. So let's start with source one. And again, if anyone has any questions, the chat box is always nice. If you raise your hand, I might see you. There's a chance. So you can try, but otherwise, throw it into the chat box. It also works. So let's look at source one. And yes, we've seen this many times, but again, this source is really where it's all based on. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says as follows, and we've seen it, I know, Vayavor Hashem al pana v'yikra. And Hashem passed in front of Moshe and he cried out. And what exactly does that mean? So Rabbi Yochanan says, Ilmale mikra kasav yeshalom. If it were not for the fact that the pasuk, that the verse stated such a thing, we would have no ability to say it ourselves. And this teaches us, says the Gemara Melamed, it teaches us, Shenisatev HaKadosh Baruch Hu K'shliach Tzibor. That Hashem wrapped himself like a chazan, like someone leading the tzibor, leading the congregation in prayer, which, by the way, last night was a beautiful, beautiful slichos. It was very nice. So I'm sure the mornings are also nice too, but the first night's always nice. The Heralo the Moshe Seder Tefillah. And what did he do? He demonstrated a certain order of prayers, a certain way a person should pray. And that's what he said. And he said, Kol zman sheYisrael chotem, anytime Bnei Yisrael sin, anytime you mess up, anytime you're in a difficult situation, Yasu lefana keseder hazeh, you should do like what I'm teaching you now, vani mocha lahem, and I'll forgive them. So ultimately, this is what we see. They were saying you should wrap yourself like a shliach tzibor. So one of the things, I forget if we touched upon this, but one of the proofs to say that you actually need a minion to say the 13 attributes, that you need that, is because exactly what did Hashem do? He wrapped himself like it's like a shliach tzibor, like someone leading a congregation. The Gemara could have said, and Hashem, stood there and prayed, or Hashem stood there and said. But it gives us a very vivid image of Hashem wrapping himself in the talis and leading like someone leading the congregation in prayer. So again, this is one of the proofs, one of the things that people touch upon to say that this, from here we see a hint towards the fact that we need a minyan, we need a quorum, we need 10 people in order to be able to recite the 13 attributes. So ultimately we have to understand, can a person say it alone? I know we've assumed that a person can't say it alone, but again, we live and we have lived in an unprecedented times, and there were many a times last year, and I'm sure this year there will be people as well that can't daven b'tzibor. They're uncomfortable for whatever the reason is that they can't daven with a minyan. So can people in these types of situations say the 13 attributes to themselves? Again, they're very powerful things. So chas v'shalom, we should lose out on them. So is there a way for a person to say it on their own? So let's look back at the Rashba. So in source 2, the Rashba, one of the early commentaries on the Gemara, so he actually, not only did he comment on the Gemara, but he had Shilos and Chuvos, questions and answers. So a question was posed to him in source 2, that im omer shleishasrei midos biyachid, can an individual without a group, without 10 men, can he say the 13 attributes? So the Rashba responded and he said, Tshuva, my answer is as follows. Mistavrali shekol she'omram derech tefila ubakashas rachamim ein nemar biyachid. It would seem to me from everything that I've looked up and everything that I've learned and everything I know about the 13 attributes, that a person who's trying to say them through supplication and prayer, that his goal is to be crying them out to God, he really can't say them in privacy. He can't say them alone. Why? Ukedavar shebegedusha. Because they're like a davar shebegedusha. What's a davar shebegedusha? It's holy words. Examples would be like kedusha, like baruch hu, like kaddish. All these things have a certain level of holiness to them that they require a group of people to be able to say them together, to be able to exclaim them. So ultimately, the 13 attributes the Rashba's saying, they are of a similar nature. They are extremely holy, and they require a group to be able to say it. And for that reason, if someone is alone, if someone is not with a group, if someone's not with a minyan, there's no chance they can't say it. There's a way around it, so we'll see. We'll see if there's a way around it. But on the bottom line, seemingly, if we assume that the 13 attributes are of this particular hidden holy nature, or what we would call devarim shepegdusha, so then you couldn't say it alone. And he says, and that's what we learn, and he gives this little hint that we just talked about in the Gemara, that God wrapped himself in a talis, seemingly implying he was davening, so to say, demonstrating this has to be done with a talis, with a group of people, like someone leading a congregation. He does end at the end, 3 lines up from the bottom, source 2. He says, Aval imbal la'omro kach derech kriya, if you want to say it just as if you're reading verses, omer kederech she'omran. Okay, so you can say it that way. Just like we find by other things that are holy. There are many psukim that we say that have really holy words in them. If you think about Uval Etzion, a person can say the words of Uval Etzion, the entire tefillah on his own, and a person can say the brachas of Shema leading up to Shema on his own. Even though they contain words such as Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavakos, right? Now, those are the same words that we say in Kedusha and we require a minyan for. But if a person is saying it, he's reading it, or he's saying it the same way he would learn a verse from the Torah. So that takes it out of the general requirement for it to be with a minyan, and a person can technically say it on their own. So that's the first advice we see, that if a person is stuck at home, if a person is uncomfortable going to shul, if a person, for some reason, whatever it is unable to be with a minyan, so they have an option of saying the 13 attributes on their own, just not saying it in the normal tune that we would say it in shul. Maybe a person lanes it, if you know how to lane. I know we've got a few quality laners over here. I was zocheh to hear one this Shabbos. But a person could say it like that. Or they could just have the tune in which they say other things. Just that they would have to avoid using the tune that they would normally use in shul, let's say. It's interesting. We don't have this the source on the sheets, but the Rif was an even earlier commentary. Rav Alfasi was generally known as a halachist. He really tried to bring down the basic halacha from the Gemara. What's the basic law? He really didn't include anything but that. Occasionally you'll find he included a little bit of the stories from the Gemara, but those are one-off cases, and you always have to wonder why he brought those. So it's interesting when the Rif actually codifies the laws from this Gemara about saying the 13 attributes and the like, so he brings it down the whole thing about when we sin, we should say these prayers, we should say these 13 attributes. And immediately after that, he brings down the Gemara about when a person is b'tzibur, when a person is with a minyan in a group of people, so there are more zechuyos, there are more merits that allow us help our prayers. So it's just interesting, I find, the juxtaposition of those two halachos that the Rif decides to put right next to each other. It almost hints as if to say, again, this idea of saying the 13 attributes really does have to do with being in a congregation, being with a group of people. And again, we touched upon the different reasons last week, besides the halachic reasons, but maybe it means that everyone together is able to, so to say, mimic all the attributes and really come together to be able to bring down that kindness from God. But seemingly right now, if we were to leave off here, the solution would be very simple, right? I can't daven in a minyan, so I can't say the 13 attributes. There's one way. Read it as if you were just reading a verse. Don't read it as if you were davening it in shul. And that's as if you're just saying verses the same way a person can daven parts of, the davening that have words of Kedusha, even though they're not actually saying Kedusha. Now, it's interesting. So that's where we would leave off. But when it comes to later authorities, it's trying to figure out what exactly is the halacha, because the Rashba is not sitting there, and we're not going to follow the Rashba straight. Remember, we follow the Shulchan Aruch, we follow Rav Yosef Cairo, the Ramah, and later commentaries. So what's the practical halacha? So in source 3, the Torah comments like this. He says, Kasov Rav Nassan. Rav Nassan writes, She'ein minhag liyachid hamisana. The custom is not for an individual who's fasting to say Yud Gimel Midos, for him to say the 13 attributes. The general custom is, unless you're with a minyan, you don't say it. Says the Torah, I don't understand what the problem is. What's the problem with an individual saying the 13 attributes? Hashem taught it to us. We know they work wonders. We know that they have a certain power to it. What's the problem with me as an individual saying it? So he says, Sharei Eino Ela Kakori B'Torah. I don't understand. I can say verses from the Torah if I want. Were these 13 attributes said in the Torah? Yeah. We learned it a few weeks ago. We learned that God listed it and they're written in the Torah. So I don't understand. When I get to those verses in the Torah, I can't read them? Of course I can. Says the Torah, of course an individual should be able to say these 13 attributes. They're just verses in the Torah. They're powerful verses. They're verses that can really, really reach through the gates of heaven, but they're verses. And he says, the rabbis only said that the only things that a person requires a minyan for, requires a quorum, requires a congregation, is for those things like Kedusha, like Kaddish, like Baruch Hu, all those things that we know require a minyan. The 13 attributes, those are just verses, those are psukim in the Torah. It's totally fine to say it, says the Torah. So again, we have the Rashba, we have the Torah, and really opposite ends, because they're claiming like this. The Rashba is saying those words of the 13 attributes, they are holy, holy words. Yes, they're verses, but they're holy words, just like Kedusha, just like Baruch Hu, just like a Kaddish that we only say with a minyan. And on the opposite extreme, we have the Torah saying, listen, they're important, but they're not what I would classify as Devarim Shebekdusha. They're not things that would be more akin to Kaddish. They're just not. So the Shulchan Aruch in source 4, how does he paskin? How does he come out? And this really matters for us. And as soon as we finish, as far as what we follow, we're going to see there are many differences and many practical differences between these two opinions that come to light for us. So in source 4, how do we paskin? How do we come down? Practical law. The Shulchan Aruch says, Ein hayachid rashai lomar shleisha midos. An individual cannot say the 13 attributes. Very simple as that. Very much like the Rashba, right? He can't say it derech tefillah ubekashas rachamim. Why? The davar shebekdushahem. He can't say it like he would be praying. He can't say them in supplication. Why? Because they're very much similar to Kaddish, to Kedusha, to Baruch Hu, all these things that a person requires a minyan for. But he adds the following qualification, just like the Rashba. If you just want to say them like you're reading verses from the Torah, no problem, it's okay. And that's fine. So ultimately, what we seem to have come out is against the Torah. We treat the 13 attributes like what I would have thought, because we know how powerful they are. We learned what they can do. So they're very holy words, and they're something akin and very much like Kaddish, Kedusha, Baruch Hu, and all these things that obviously we require a minyan for. But again, the qualification is if a person does want to say them, you can say them not in supplication, not in prayer, not with the classic tune we would use, but just as if I'm reading psukim, just as if I'm reading verses from the Torah, and that would make it appropriate for me as an individual to say it at home, absent of a minyan.
Rabbi,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, just something troubling. The halacha seems to rest very substantially on the image of Rabbi Yochanan with the talus, the God wrapping himself in a talus as a shliach tzibur. He specifically says that. But in our time, individuals wrap themselves in a talus also. And if God was davening by himself, in our custom, he would wrap himself in a talus. I don't know, the custom in Rabbi Yochanan's time may have been only the shliach tzibur did it, but I mean, since then, the custom has been to wrap yourself in a talus and so what would that have told us about the tzibur? Nothing.
Right. So it's a good point. I would wonder why the Gemara had to choose the language of like a shliach tzibur. It could have just said he wrapped himself in a talus, right? And they were wearing talisim back then as well. So I think to answer your question, I think the very fact that it chose to use that language of like the shliach tzibur, someone leading a congregation, I think that imagery harkens an image of something more similar, like a minyan and the like. Now, I don't know if that's the only proof. I think it's one of the ideas that they come off of. It's almost like, I don't want to say it this way because chas v'shalom, I don't mean it this way. It's like a cute idea in the sense that they learn that, oh, well, now that we know that these are holy words, maybe this is a little bit of to buttress the point. But I don't know if the entire argument is completely off of that line. I think the argument that the Rashba is coming from to say that you need a minyan is these are holy words. These are things that are much more akin to Baruch Hu, Kaddish, and when the rabbi said, and when the rabbis took these words from the Torah that we're going to be saying them, they essentially dictated that these would have to be said in a minyan. So I hear what you're asking. It's a good point. If we were only coming from that line alone, I would agree. I think it would be, weak, but I think we could question. But I think how the rabbis took it down was they assumed it to be very potent, powerful words that should be stated in a minyan. So I think that's one approach. So that's how we paskin, right? We treat them like Devarim Shebedusha, holy words. On the other hand, there are those opinion, the Torah and others who he cites, I think Talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah maybe, that hold that they're holy words, but they're not ones that require us to be with a minyan. So what are the practical differences? And practically, if I am alone, how do I say it? So the Mishnah Berurah, we don't have it on the sheet, but the Mishnah Berurah off of the Shulchan Aruch, the Chafetz Chaim, he wrote the Mishnah Berurah, he comments and he says, what it means to say it just reading it, it means with a little bit of a tune. You want to say Hashem, Hashem, so use a bit of a different tune that you might use in shul. Use the tune that you might use when you're learning. Use the tune that you might use when you're just reading a verse from the Torah. Just read it. So something like that would allow an individual to say it alone. And that, the truth is, if we want to know practically, does that really work for us? So Rav Moshe in Source 5 says it. No one had as big of shoulders as Rav Moshe. They say from, what is it, Mimoshe to Moshe. They had from Moshe Rabbeinu to the Rambam to Rav Moshe. I mean, Rav Moshe has a lot of very important opinions, and we take what he has to say not that lightly at all. What he says is very often something that we have to factor into daily halacha. So in source 5, he says, Ubedavar your gimel midos biyachid. When it comes to the 13 attributes being stated in private with just an individual, ha'ikr sheyomar kol pasuk ad ribiim. He should say the whole thing until the word ribiim. The gam dafka b'lei nigan d'tachanunim. He shouldn't say it with the classic tune that one uses to pray in shul. Ela kilomed b'torah, rather like someone's tune that they use when they're learning. That the same way how he would read psukei Torah, the same way, let's say, how he would lane, or he has a normal tune that he uses. So you can use that in order to read these 13 attributes when he's alone. And he said, based on that, just outside, in such a way, it would be appropriate to do that. And I think that is the general practice, that if someone finds themselves at home and they want to be able to say it, so a person could say it, just you have to be careful how you're saying it. And have in mind, I'm not saying this like I would be saying it in the shul. And I think that is, many people do take that approach. You should know the Yalkut Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, his halachos that they put together, Rabbi Yosef has a very similar approach. And he says, just not the normal way a person would daven it. So now, what's the practical difference? So we saw there are two sides again. Do we treat it like Kedusha and Kaddish or not? So one difference again is if a person can say it as an individual. And we just saw that, right? If it's like Kaddish, so you really can't say as an individual. You have to figure out how one would do it. Versus the opinion that thought it's not like Kaddish and Kedusha, no problem, it would be fine. So are there any other practical differences that come out? So there are definitely a few questions, right? Now, for example, very often Selichos go fast. Even on Yom Kippur, the Ne'ilah can go fast. So what happens if the tzibor, if the minyan is going faster than I am, and they get up to the 13 attributes? Right now they're at the 13 attributes, but I'm in the middle, I don't know where. Some slicha, some piyut. So should I stop what I'm doing and should I say the 13 attributes with them? I know I have to say it in minyan. I am in a minyan, but I'm not saying it with them. So practically, what do you do if they're far ahead of you? Now that's one that could come up very often. Another question, if you think about it, if you're a Sephardi and you're davening in an Ashkenazi minyan on just, any day. So can a Sephardi clap his chest and do tachnon and say the 13 attributes quietly to himself, even though the Ashkenazi minyan isn't saying it? Or on the other hand, I'll take a look at this in a second. On the other hand, what about if an Ashkenazi is in a Sephardi minyan and the Sephardim are saying the 13 attributes? Should he say it with them as well? And that's not his nusach, that's not what he normally does. So should he? Right? So those are two questions that are definitely going to come to light. So how do we deal with that? And in the meantime, we have a question that just came through. I'll read it. You say that an individual cannot say the 13 attributes by himself or herself like Kedusha. But an individual can say parts of Kedusha by themselves. For example, in Shachris, like Shema, there's a mini Kedusha. Yes, I think that's the exact point which we're saying here. It's a good question. Just to explain, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We say that both in Kedusha, which we need a minyan for, yet we say it in the prayers leading up to Shema. So an individual is allowed to say that line. So it depends when. It depends on the context. And I think that's the same difference here. If there's a context like where we're exclaiming it as a congregation of Kedusha, where we say Kadosh, 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 then that would be inappropriate for an individual to be saying that part of the text on his own. And that's why we require a minyan. But to be saying it as a line within the prayers before, and less so as a prayer, and more so this is what the angels are saying and the like, the context matters. And I think that that's what all the commentaries are trying to suggest here when it comes to the 13 attributes. Context matters. If a person is saying it within the context of davening and praying, so yeah, that requires the minyan. If you want to say it, well, it's a pasuk, it's a verse. So the context in which you say it like a verse, and that would perhaps allow one to say it. So I think they are very similar, and I think it's the same answer, that context matters and how you say it matters. It's a good question. It's a very good point. Okay, so again, we have to answer. People are ahead of me. Where do I go? If I'm an Ashkenazi and a Sephardi minyan, or vice versa, what am I supposed to do? And the last question, which we really have to address, and don't worry, all these will kind of be answered all at once a little, so we're not here till 10 o'clock tonight, don't worry. The last question, which we really have to think about, is what if I already davened and I'm sitting in the back of shul, or I walk by shul, or something of the sorts, and I hear people saying the 13 attributes. So I have to stop and say it with them now? Do I? That's another question which we have to think about. So let's look at source 6, and that's the Chayab. So he talks about this idea, do I have to stop and say it, and say the 13 attributes with a congregation if I hear it? Now, this doesn't very often happen in our shuls. But for example, if someone is in Eretz Yisrael, and Ritz Hashem, we should all be there soon. But if someone is in Eretz Yisrael at the Kotel, it happens all the time. You're in one minyan, you're milling around, you're here, and you hear these people saying Kedusha, you hear these people saying 13 attributes. Do I have to start answering that? Right? I hear it all around me. What do I have to answer? What do I not? Do I have to stand still? No. So the Chai Adam says like this, that in source 6, Kishat Tzibor Korim Kriya Shema, when the congregation is saying Shema, Chayiv Likros Imayim Pasuk Rishon. It's true. If you hear the congregation saying Shema, even though you already said Shema, you have to say it with them. And he continues after the parentheses, B'tov sheyikra imayim kol kriya shema, v'kabel schar k'korei b'Torah. And it would be good to even read the entire Shema. And yes, you're not fulfilling your obligation of saying Shema because you already did that, but you are accomplishing reading verses from the Torah, and you're joining the congregation and accepting the yoke of heaven upon ourselves together. So if a person passes by and they're saying Shema, yeah, you should cover your eyes and you should say Shema. By the way, that's practical halacha. If you're in a minyan and you're walking by and they say Shema, a person should quickly say Shema with them. And he continues in the bold, and similarly, he says anything that the congregation is doing. You walk by, they're saying Aleinu, they're saying this, they're saying anything. If they're saying it and you walk by, you should involve yourself in it. You should say it along with them. Okay, you don't have to stay for the whole davening, but you should say part of it with them. Because a person shouldn't be separate from the congregation. If they're doing something, you should involve yourself in it. Now, don't worry. I don't think that that's completely practical halacha. If you walked away now, we'd be a little bit in trouble, because you shouldn't walk away thinking that every time I pass a minyan, now I have to sit down. Okay, enkel ahenu, let's go. Right? That's not what's happening here. That's not. According to Chayei Adam, maybe, but we're going to see practically, it's not always the case, but certainly Shema. That is the halacha. If we pass by and they're saying Shema, Kedusha, any of these holy statements which require minyan, or not just require minyan, but they're statements which we're accepting God upon ourselves, so we should involve ourselves in it with the congregation. So, what are the other opinions? Do I have to stop? Do I have to answer along? So the Tzitz Eliezer, we'll say this one outside. Rav Waldenberg quotes Rav Shlomo Kluger, and he says, Rav Shlomo Kluger says, absolutely not. If you're in the middle of davening, or if you're standing there, you shouldn't be answering. You shouldn't be answering to the 13 attributes. Yes, the 13 attributes are holy. Yes, they're similar to Kedusha and other things in some sense, that you need a minyan. But the reason why, when you pass by a minyan with Kedusha and Shema, is because you have to join in the minyan to exclaim God's holiness, or to accept God's yoke upon us. And that's not what we're doing with the 13 attributes. So he says, no. If you walk by the minyan, they're saying the 13 attributes, you already davened, no need to say anything. And certainly, if you're in the middle of Psuka de Zimra, if you're in the middle of another part of davening, absolutely not. You shouldn't stop to say it. Rav Waldenberg, he's not so sure. He doesn't think you're obligated to stop and say it, but he said it would technically be okay. So we have a machlok. Yes.
What about if you pass by and they're reading Torah?
And
read Kriyas Torah. Do you step inside to listen to the Kriyas Torah?
I don't think a person is under an obligation to do so. I don't believe so. That's you'd have to be very careful when you're walking around Stiebels. If that was the case, you'd get stuck really, really often. Couldn't go to Stiebels. But no, it's a good question. I don't believe so. It's definitely worth looking up. I can look that up just to make sure. That's a good question. But other things would. Kedusha, you're hearing it, a person should stop and stand and say Kedusha. Certainly if you're, the door is open, you're right there. Yeah. So ultimately, okay, we have a bunch of opinions, but what's practical? What should I do if I hear that binyan saying it? So Rav Moshe really has a lot to say here. See, he comes along and he says in the bold in source 8, do I have to stop and say the 13 attributes of mercy if I hear people saying them? L'chora, he says, Ezechi of yesh lios, delo dami lamash mechuyavin la'anos kedusha b'chol pam sheshomen. He says, I'm not really sure what obligation there would be to say the 13 attributes if I already said them and I hear other people saying them. It's not completely comparable to someone who hears Kedusha, which other people are saying. Because when it comes to Kedusha, he says, the whole point, and I'm saying this outside, the whole point of Kedusha is that we're coming together to exclaim God's holiness. And it would be very odd and almost inappropriate for me to walk by and sit back and say, but I'm not doing that. It doesn't sit well. So says Rav Moshe, when it comes to Kedusha, the reason why when you pass by you have to say it with them is because it would be inappropriate to separate yourself and say, I'm not exclaiming God's holiness. So the 13 attributes of mercy, they're not exclaiming God's holiness per se. They're more like a tefillah. They're more like a supplication. So maybe it wouldn't be inappropriate for me. I already supplicated. Is that a word? Supplicated? Okay. I already supplicated. Okay. So maybe I don't need to. And then he says, and Bikar Kriya Shema, what about someone who davened and said Shema? The reason over there that you have to stop and say it with them, even though you already said it, is because it shouldn't chas v'shalom look that I pass by my friends accepting God upon themselves, Shema Yisroel, and I'm saying, okay, I'm just going to walk by, not me. It doesn't look good. So ultimately, the reason why a person has to involve himself in saying Shema with the rest of the Chevra who's saying it, or Kedusha, is there really specific reasons. One is because it has, everyone else is accepting God upon themselves, so I should be too at the same time. And the other one is we're really exclaiming God's holiness, and that's something I should be involved with. But ultimately, when it comes to 13 attributes, maybe neither of those reasons apply. And although they're holy words, there's really nothing that would necessitate me to have to say it with them. I could, but nothing that would obligate me. So that's how Rav Moshe seems to come out. But he does say, in the last few lines, the bold, Aval minhag ha'olam hula haskiram. The custom is to say it. If you hear people saying it, the custom is to say it. And he explains, because ultimately, maybe every additional person who's willing to exclaim and proclaim the 13 attributes together with a group helps. Maybe every additional person that jumps in and says, oh, I want to daven for God's mercy, helps everyone else. So when you pass by, is there an obligation? Maybe not. But is it the right thing to do? Yeah, because it means joining in with other Jews. It means joining in with other people saying, I too care about this group. I too care about all the other people. And I want to daven for mercy for every single one of us, even though I already davened this morning. So that's Rav Moshe's approach. And I think it makes a lot of sense. If everything we've learned about the 13 attributes is that we're trying to bring God's mercy down, but it's really a collective whole that we try to do that as. So it's a certain sensitivity we should have as we walk by other people saying the 13 attributes, thinking, oh yeah, I should join with them and say that. So is it an obligation? Probably not. Is it a nice thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? I think so. So that's basically how it would come out with the 13 attributes, that we treat them like holy words that need a minyan, but don't obligate one to say it with the minyan when they're passing by, but it's the right thing to do. And it's certainly the appropriate thing to do. So that's ultimately one approach. And that's to answer our question about if I'm passing by and they're saying it. But what about if Selichos is going too fast and I'm not up to the 13 attributes, right? What am I supposed to do then? Am I supposed to stop where I am? What am I supposed to do? So the Yalkut Yosef, or Rabbi Yosef, actually tells us for Sfardim, and it's a general suggestion that I think is appropriate for Ashkenazim, as we'll see, that if you're in the parsha, so to say, if you're in the area, you already started the paragraph of Kel Melech, or you're Vayavor Hashem, and you're just a little bit behind, but you're in the general area with the minyan. So that's as if you're saying it with the minyan already. Okay, so you're a line behind, you're a few seconds behind, maybe even 60 seconds behind, but you're in the same area. So that's as if you're saying it with a minyan, and it would still be appropriate to say the 13 attributes. So that leaves us a little high and dry if I'm really far behind. Sometimes I just read slow, right? Sometimes I'm just not going to be with the minyan. Sometimes they go really fast. So if I'm paragraphs behind, what's the appropriate thing to do? So this is very helpful for us. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach suggests that if I'm in the middle of a paragraph elsewhere, I should stop. I should say the 13 attributes with the minyan. I can go back to reading what I'm reading. But again, to highlight this idea that really ideally, whenever we exclaim the 13 attributes, we should exclaim it with others. We should exclaim it and proclaim it with each other. So just to go over that again, because I know there are a lot of opinions. Ultimately, if the minyan is moving too fast, or I just need to say things at a slower pace, so that's appropriate, it's okay. But in order to get the 13 attributes with the minyan, so ideally, try to be in the general vicinity. And even if I'm not, Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, okay, stop, say the 13 with them, and then you can go back to whatever you were saying before. So that would be a general approach if it's moving fast. So now we get to, I would say, the more exciting topic and the more exciting question. That is if a Sephardi is in an Ashkenazi minyan or an Ashkenazi is in a Sephardi minyan. Now, I'll tell you, I davened with the Sephardim the other night. I try to figure out what's flying, but I'm really lost. Do I stand for Kaddish? Do I sit for Kaddish? I don't know. And then they started saying this other Tehillim. I don't know. So I pulled off a Sephardi sitter from the shelf, hoping that would help me. I was even more lost once I opened that one up. So what am I supposed to do if I'm with the Sephardim? So let's start with that. So this, if I'm an Ashkenazi at Sephardi shul and they're saying the 13 attributes, what am I supposed to do? So, I'll open it up for a second. What do you think? Based on everything we said, if I'm an Ashkenazi at a Sephardi shul, and during the week, normally I don't say the 13 attributes of mercy, but Sephardim, they do because that's part of their tachton. So what would you suggest I do? Any thoughts? What's the right thing for me to do at that Sephardi minyan? Okay.
I guess you would say it.
Okay.
When you're part of the minyan, you follow the minhag of the place that you're at.
Okay, I see everyone's nodding along with you, Richard. You are 100% correct. That is definitely the appropriate thing to do. If you're in a Sephardi minyan as an Ashkenazi, open up your sitter, tachton, clap your chest, and say the 13 attributes of mercy, because that's the appropriate thing to do with the minyan that you are with, right? So that would be if an Ashkenazi is in a Sephardi shul. Now, if a Sephardi is in an Ashkenazi shul, so generally what would happen is like this. See, we're not saying the 13 attributes. So comes along the Sephardi and he finishes his Amida, and now we go to, lay our heads down and do the rest of Tachnan. And here's the Sephardi standing up. Is he supposed to hit his chest? He's supposed to say the 13 attributes. There's no minyan. I mean, there's a minyan, but there's no minyan of people saying the 13 attributes with him. So what's he supposed to do? So Rav Moshe says, like this in the bold in source 11, Imrotze lomar vidui koden nefilas apayim. If a person who has the custom, or even an Ashkenazi who says Nusach Sfard, it would be true of, if he wishes to say vidui with hitting his chest and the 13 attributes, if he wants to do it, he has to do it without making it noticeable to other people. Because a person can't do something that's apparently different than the rest of the shul. So if I'm a Sephardi, or if I'm an Ashkenazi who does Nusach Sfard and I do Tachton and I do Hashamnu, Bagadnu on a daily basis, so if I'm in that Ashkenazi minyan, ideally I wouldn't be hitting my chest. I would just say it quietly, and I would say the 13 attributes, again, as we suggested. He says over here, you're not able to say the 13 attributes because you need 10 people saying it. So the same thing that we suggested before, you can say it in how a person would learn it, or the verses. But these are the suggestions that Rav Moshe has for someone who normally says the 13 attributes and you're in a minyan that doesn't say it. So don't make it apparent that you're saying it. And again, use that tune as opposed to the classic tune that you might use when you're davening. So this just leads us to the last part. That is, in general, if I'm davening in a minyan and things are different, what exactly am I supposed to do? Right? This is less related and not 100%, related to our topic as far as the 13 attributes. But it's just a general question. If I go to another shul that they daven a different nusach, am I supposed to take my Ashkenazi sitter off the shelf and daven from it? Or am I supposed to take off whatever nusach they're using, right? I go to a Sephardi minyan. Should I take their sitter and daven with them? Or very often, I used to daven in Eish Kodesh in the 5 towns with my in-laws. So over there, they daven nusach Sfard. It's not so far off from an Ashkenazi sitter. Should I take that? I'm davening at Chabad. What sitter should I use? So in source 12, Rav Moshe basically breaks it down. And the first one we've already talked about, so we'll skip that. I'll just say it outside, and that is things that are readily apparent to other people, those have to be said with them. Meaning, it doesn't matter what nusach I daven. The things I say out loud with the minyan have to be what the minyan says. So normally an Ashkenazi would say Nekadesh Shimcha Ba'olam. That's the words I would use for Kedusha. But if I'm by a Sephardi minyan, or I'm by Nusach Sfard, so I should use their Kedusha. Now Ritzach, V'nakdishach, anything I'm saying out loud that would be readily apparent, I should say with them, because it's not good to make ourselves look different. We should try to be a unified group saying the same things to Hashem when we're davening. So that's anything I'm saying out loud. And that again plays a role in whether or not I should say the 13 attributes out loud, right? If I'm in a minyan that doesn't say it, so should I be saying it? So the answer that Rav Moshe would say is not out loud, because we can't be different like that. We have to show a unified front. But when it comes to, for example, things that are totally silent, like the private Amida, like the silent Amida, there you should stick to your nusach. Stick to what you're comfortable with, stick to what you normally say and how you say it, because that's not going to show up as readily different from everybody else. The only question is about things in the middle. So let's see that at the end. In source 12, the last bolded words. What happens if you're in a different minyan? Should you say Psuki de Zimra ubirchos kriya Shema? Should you say the blessings of Shema and Psuki de Zimra differently than everyone else? Right? What exactly am I supposed to take the siddur off the shelf and use their siddur for those parts of davening or not? So Rav Moshe says, Rashai la'omram gam b'koram. See, these parts of davening, Psuki de Zimra, the preliminary prayers, the prayers leading up to Shema, those are technically a person could say them out loud. Hanishma la'achirim, and other people would hear them. Hasmucham etzlo, people near him would hear what he's saying. So he says, Yeshli stapek im rashai la'omram b'nusach shiragu b'lachash. He says, there's what to doubt or to think. Should I really be saying it in my normal nusach? Should I be saying it in the normal way I say it? Maybe I should be following what they say because, again, the things that are out loud, I have to follow the minyan. So since these could be said out loud, maybe I should be following what the minyan says. So Moshe says, V'yesh lomar, the approach should perhaps be, she'aser af balachash. Maybe I should be saying what they're saying, even quietly. Maybe I should follow the custom of the minyan completely. Why? Because Shema Yishkach me lomar balachash. Perhaps I'm going to forget. I'm going to get really into davening. I like saying things out loud. So maybe I'm going to start saying what I'm used to, and I'm going to start saying it out loud. And the person next to me is going to be bothered. Oh, hey, that's not our nusach here. That's not how we daven here. And ultimately, because of that, maybe, says Rav Moshe, really the siddur that you take off the shelf when you get to shul should be whatever that shul davens. Because we don't want to create machlokas. We don't want to create arguments. We don't want to create anything that would bother people or mess up that unified front that we're supposed to be presenting in a shul. So that's Rav Moshe's approach, really, against 3 levels. Something that we say out loud with the minyan together, that we should follow whatever they say. And that applies to the 13 attributes. Things that are completely quiet, like the silent Amida, I can say however I want. The middle ground, other prayers. So Rav Moshe seems to suggest that, ideally maybe follow what they're doing. As a postscript to that, Rav Moshe, it's true, Rav Moshe says that, but I think generally the minhag is, and I spoke to a few Rabbanim, I think what the custom is that we just say our regular nusach, we pick our regular siddur that we're used to, and anything that's out loud, we should say out loud with the minyan. I think that's the general approach. Okay, if a person wants to daven whatever shul, whatever they're davening, Rav Moshe certainly says that it would be appropriate, but I think the general custom is just what they're saying out loud to make sure you're saying with them, and everything else a person could use their siddur. That seems to be the approach. Okay, so I know we said a lot, so let's bring it home. Let's do a quick summary. We said the 13 attributes are, or are they not? We had a discussion. Are they words of Kedusha and holiness, just like Kaddish and Kedusha and Baruch Hu that can only be said in a minyan? And what are the practical differences? So practically, we said that yes, we treat them like really holy words that they have to be said in a minyan. If a person can't be in a minyan, there's a way to chop it. There's a way to still say it, as if you're reading a verse, just as it's written in the Torah. You could read it that way. And what if I'm behind in a minyan and they're up to the 13 attributes? Can I say it with them? Do I lose out? So the answer is you can say it with them. You can say it. Certainly, if you're close enough, you don't even need to say it. If you're a few seconds behind, it would still be appropriate, and as if you're saying it with them. And another question we had was, what if I'm walking by a minyan and they're saying the 13 attributes? So although it came out that we're not obligated to recite it with them, it's certainly nice. It's certainly a good thing to do, and certainly praiseworthy, because we're joining together with all Bnei Yisrael, with all other Jews, trying to ask Hashem for forgiveness and His kindness to bring it down into our lives. And again, the last thing that we said, and this really comes up across davening, and it's not limited to the 13 attributes, but if I'm in a minyan where they don't say the 13 attributes or vice versa, so what's the rule of thumb? And the rule of thumb really seems to be that if it's going to be something that's out loud, I really have to follow what that minyan is doing. Okay, I can do it quietly, maybe on my own. Anything that's quiet on my own, I can follow and do my own personal custom, because it's not going to be noticed, it'll be quiet and the like. But anything such as the 13 attributes should be said with the minyan, because there's this beautiful thing about presenting a unified front to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, especially when we're in Rosh Hashanah and coming at this time. We're trying to present this certain level of achdus, of unity, and that it couldn't be that I would walk past a minyan or be part of a minyan that I'm trying to demonstrate, well, I'm actually an individual and I want to do my own thing. I want to be an iconoclast. That's not the approach, and certainly not during Elul, certainly not during Rosh Hashanah. We should really try to put that unified front, be together. And if I were to pass by a minyan saying the 13 attributes, am I obligated to say it? No. But should I say it? Should I want to say it with the minyan? Yes. So I think that those are just some halachos, some ideas that came out of the past few weeks, come out that really come into light in our practical daily life over the next 2 weeks, between Selichos, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and the like. So Amir Hashem, we should be zocha to, again, bring down those Yud Gimel Midos by acting them out as a tzibor, as a minyan, as a group together. And by that way, as the Tomer Devorah said, helping Hashem then bring them down to our lives for the year to come. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Baruch Rabbi.
Okay, and of course, as Minhag has it, the custom is if anyone has any questions, please feel free to stay on, ask any questions. If you have a really good question, well, we don't have a shir on this next week, so you won't be able to get the shout out of me saying I didn't have an answer, now I do. But we can always talk in shul. So, but please feel free.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.